Well, this is our May 3rd session of the Climate and Health Responder course for Latin America. This course is organized by the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, and the Pan American Health Organization. You can listen to this course in Spanish or English. If you look at your screen below, you should have a button to select the English or Spanish interpretation according to your needs. This is a 5-week course. We meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today, we're going to deal with El Niño and La Niña effects and extratropical cyclones. We have Dr. Juan José Nieto, and we're going to introduce him right now. And this is the schedule for the next few weeks. Sessions are 90-minute sessions. We have 60 minutes with presentations and then 30 minutes for questions and answers. We need your questions to be submitted in the Q&A section in Zoom. Please do not enter those in the chat because we have so many participants. It's difficult to follow in the chat. The main language is Spanish, as you may have noticed, but we have simultaneous interpreting into English. In about 12 hours, we're going to be posting the recorded session. This session is being recorded right now. The slides will be posted to the course's website, and everyone here today will receive an email with any links. You do not need to write in the chat that you need the slides. You are going to receive them. You may have received an email with some suggested reading material. If you haven't read those for today, we recommend that you do read those before its session so you can take better advantage of the course. Some are really quick, short readings, and it's good to have an introduction to the topic. This is the website. You registered for this course on this website, and we encourage you to continue to promote this course. There are no limits. People can still enroll. And if you enroll, you can still receive updates on this course and the links to the materials. This is very important because not everyone can join us today, but everyone can learn from this course. Let's begin with Dr. Juan José Nieto from the International Research Center for the El Niño phenomenon, and I'm going to read a brief introduction. Dr. Juan José Nieto has been working at CFEN for more than 12 years in the development of sectoral climate services. His work has been oriented to climate analysis with emphasis on climate impacts, risk management, and climate change. It focuses on connecting and creating bridges between climate information and decision makers from various sectors. Among other activities, he coordinates the Western South America Regional Season Forecast Group and the monthly publication of ocean climate El Niño related news. He coordinates a network of volunteers for climate monitoring pilot areas in South America. This network seeks to promote the involvement of communities in climate issues. He has been an instructor on issues related to climate and ocean in various workshops and participated in several publications and regional projects related to climate, its extreme manifestations, the associated risks, and its impact on various sectors of development. Welcome, and I give you the floor now. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. where I hopefully this will be an interesting presentation for you. I'm going to start sharing my screen. As Irene was mentioning, we have some reading material, but in case you haven't been able to access or read it before, if you have any question throughout the talk, or if you need further information, I would be glad to answer. I am José Nieto. I work at the International Research Center for El Niño phenomenon. For a few years, I have worked here in Guayaquil, Ecuador. I apologize if you can hear any background noises because I am downtown, and so you could hear ambulances or things like that going by. The learning objectives for today are first to describe how climate change is causing some alterations both in El Niño and La Niña phenomena and the frequency of extratropical cyclones in this region, especially in Latin America and South America, to explore how extreme events lead to human displacement and projections for the future. And finally, to explain how the impacts on the health that climate variability and climate change, we're going to discuss the differences between these two, will vary within and between different communities and regions. And we're going to show some examples about this. But then, and to bring all of this down to earth, to a more practical level, Carolina will discuss some issues and her experience in the area. So to begin, first, let's see what ENSO is. We have heard El Niño and La Niña. We're not going to go into too much detail because that's not the purpose of this talk. If you have questions, of course, I would be glad to answer. But we can see ENSO as the word that includes both El Niño and La Niña. But what is it? Well, there are many definitions, but to give maybe a easier definition to understand is sort of a feedback between the equatorial Pacific Ocean and the atmosphere. It's like a dance between the ocean and the atmosphere, which are, of course, connected and interacting with each other. But on occasions, when there are anomalies, either in the ocean or the atmosphere in that region, and one of them has an anomaly, there is a feedback. One of them favors the behavior of the other one and influences the behavior of the other one. For example, we can have abnormal behavior in the ocean that causes abnormal behaviors in the atmosphere and the other way around. And this causes changes in the atmosphere. So climate, which is ruled by these two systems, and this has manifestations that are outside of the normal ranges. So ENSO refers both to an event related to El Niño or La Niña. One important characteristic is that it's a cyclical phenomenon. So it's going to happen again. It's not precisely periodical. There are average number of years, but we do know that it's a cycle. And we also know that climate change is accelerating the frequency. And that is something that we have been seeing in the last few years. They are becoming more frequent. It's also important to know that there is a beginning and there is an ending. if we can know when it's going to begin and when it's going to end. The impact, even though the impact is more severe in the region comprising the countries of Ecuador, Colombia, more severely, it has impacts around the globe because all climate systems are connected, just like in the human body, all systems are connected. In nature and in our climate systems, everything is connected and the effects of one have an impact on others. It's also very important the severity of the El Niño. Let's talk about El Niño in this case, but also it includes La Niña. It has to do with the heat levels in the ocean. That's that determines the intensity of the phenomena. That is something called Niño 3.4 in the Pacific Ocean around the equatorial area. The scientists evaluate the variation in temperature compared to an average reference. Not all El Niño events have the same intensity, but the intensity will depend on that temperature variation. It happens a lot here in Ecuador that we associate the amount of rainfall with severity, but that's not accurate because rainfall is not an indicator of severity, because in other countries like Colombia, Venezuela, they they don't have as much rainfall. So what is accurate is the variation in ocean temperature, specifically in this area in the Pacific Ocean. That is just something I wanted to make clear. What is happening with El Niño? How can climate change affect it? There are some studies that have been published recently in January of this year. For example, Jane Collins and others mentioned that the annual mean sea surface temperature signal in the tropical has already emerged across much of the tropical Pacific, appearing last in the east. So we already have signs that that climate change is affecting the behavior of El Niño phenomena. And other studies, such as the one below from Kai and NG, compare the 20th and the 21st century and show an increase in variability under different emission scenarios. So there is an effect of climate change on this kind of phenomena, even though they're not have the same causes or the same nature. The El Niño events acting on a climate that is affected by change will have an impact.
Graphic from this study, we can see on the green bars that refer to the intensities of the anomalous temperatures of the sea from the 1900s to 1999. We can see the variations from 1999. This has been done by climate researchers, and we can clearly see that there is an increase in terms of anomalous temperatures of the sea in those regions. And this is a clear effect of climate change. And what are the effects of the El Niño effect, both El Niño and La Niña? The effects are very diverse. They depend on the region, the time of the year, and they're not always the same. Because if there are droughts in my country due to El Niño, the same will not always happen. It will happen most of the time, but not always. And so we can't categorize it in such a way. The consequences and the effects will not always be the same. And so we need to monitor the information from meteorological services. Another important subject to mention here is to resort to official sources of information, because the internet is a good network, but of course, we are bombarded with information that is not necessarily true. So the El Nino event and La Nina cause droughts in different places depending on the features. This is generally the case, especially when we're talking about intense events. In other places, changes caused by El Nino and La Nina refer to floods. In other areas, there can be an increase in the number of hurricanes or tropical storms. And there are different manifestations of events in different parts of the world, such as the emergence of El Nino events, which are part of what is known as climate variability. And we're going to see this in more detail, which I mentioned just before, but without going into lots of detail. A picture taken from the University of Columbia shows the average of the effects of El Nino in terms of rainfall at global level, because as I was mentioning, El Nino does not only affect the equatorial region of the Pacific, but also where the effects are more severe and intense, but through what we call the different connections of these climate events, this has repercussions in all of the world. And the green areas usually become more rainy. And then we've got the yellow areas which become drier on average. And that's speaking in general terms, but we can't categorize it as such. However, in terms of hurricanes, what happens during the events of El Nino, especially in the Pacific region and in the North Pacific and the Caribbean? Because of El Nino events and the behavior of the wind and other factors, including temperature of the ocean, there is a fewer number of hurricanes during the El Nino events. And this is generally the case. However, during the El Nino events, there are more hurricanes on the side of the North Pacific Ocean. There are severe storms that take place in the northern part of the Pacific Ocean that create extreme weather events that affect the coast of this side of the Americas, both Central America and South America. On the other hand, La Nina, and this is also a picture taken from the University of Columbia, shows the same, but the average distribution of rainfall due to La Nina can be seen, as well as the effect at global level. The green areas are where there is most rainfall, and then there are other areas that become drier, which is usually the norm. And as I said, this is in general terms. However, during the La Nina events, there are a greater number of hurricanes in the Caribbean and a lower number of them in the North Pacific Ocean. Now, in order to try to understand the differences, which are important when we make decisions and when we analyze the topic, between the difference between climate variability and climate change, I'll read out a definition that I thought was very practical from Dr. José Daniel Pavón from the National University of Columbia, which says climate variability are the fluctuations of the changes that take place in the predominant conditions of an area. That means, so it's a fluctuation in the climate of an area. And climate change, on the other hand, is a shift in those predominant conditions of the climate in the long term. And that graph will perhaps help you in understanding this definition. These red curves, which fluctuate, could be considered as the records of rainfall throughout the years, and they move on an average basis in terms of climate. During these months, the rainfall in the region of Central America change like this. There are more humid years, others which are less humid, and so on. But after a few years, due to the El Niño or La Niña events, but that's not the only reason, but there are more, there are years where there is more rain than others, and that's part of the climate variability. However, climate change has this average line that becomes increasingly sharp. For instance, in areas where there are heavier rains, that average curve, which is considered normal, becomes sharper. And so variability will continue to happen. We will still have dry and wet periods, but it will move in a more intense curve, so to speak. So climate variability is a sharp climate anomaly. It's temporary, because such as the El Niño and La Niña, it varies from, it takes place every 2 years more or less, and it's quite identifiable because we can see whether there's been heavier rain than before or than average in a certain time, and we can identify that anomaly. And during those cycles and periods, there can be events such as these, and during the course of human life, there can be many taking place, many events of extreme climate variability, including El Niño and La Niña. And we have seen a record of this for many centuries. So these events have been taking place and will continue to take place. And we can draw closer together every 6 and 7 months. We can then anticipate more accurately, but no more than that. What we do know is that the El Niño events from 97, 92, 91 will continue to occur, and their effects will continue to take place. And that's why we need to be prepared and ready, because we know that these events will happen once again, both El Niño and La Niña events of that magnitude. And climate will continue to hit us with extreme variability, and in terms of climate change as well. Climate change, on the other hand, takes place gradually. It's very slow. It's almost unnoticeable, and it expands on a long period of time. It is not that noticeable, and its life cycle cannot be seen by a human being. We can see that perhaps the temperatures rise or fall, but that's more difficult to spot with climate change. But it does exist. And perhaps a few years ago, there was a debate on whether there was climate change, but I think that that's not a debate anymore. I think that there's enough proof that climate is changing, and there are different parameters that, such as temperature, humidity, and others that are changing. So let's now take a short break where we're going to ask for your participation on this. We wanted to ask you what you think are the main impacts of extreme climate of climate variability in the territories where you live. We had to limit this. Of course, there could be more, but we wanted to see which one would be the main one. Is it flooding? Is it droughts? Is it landslides? Trying to encompass all phenomena referring to this. Could it be heat waves or cold waves? Which ones do you consider to be the main impact when climate behaves in a more extreme manner? So thank you for sharing with us your answers. And we can already see some of the results. We can see that as many of the studies show, flooding and droughts are the most impact on the territories. According to the polls that we are having a look at, it exceeds 40%, 30% for droughts. Especially flooding is related to variations in rainfall. And of course, it's important to have measurements in place and keep a record of temperatures for estimating droughts. But in some cases, there are other impacts mentioned as well. Heat waves and cold waves are more related to short-term effects, but they take place anyway. And there could be specific regions where these events are more prone to happen. So we are all aware that climate and its extreme events hit us and do so frequently and yearly. Now let's delve a bit more into the topic that concerns us today, which is climate change and how it relates to health. Some studies, such as the one from the group Lancet Countdown in its 2021 report, mentions that in the last 30 years, the number of days which are climate adequate, so the environmental conditions are adequate for the development of a certain bacteria, has doubled. This bacteria, Vibrio, causes many of the diarrhea diseases around the world. And we also find the adequate conditions for the development of diseases that result in the dengue fever and malaria and others related. Other findings of this study and this report show that promoted by climate change, according to the report, the viral disease of dengue fever transmitted by mosquitoes is transmitted more at a greater speed in all of the world. And the climate change is creating the adequate conditions for these diseases to thrive. Another finding is that 9 out of the 10 more adequate years for the transmission of dengue fever have taken place since 2000. And climate change, it has been creating extreme events, not only in terms of climate, but also in terms of health. Mosquitoes have invaded full territories, and according to this study, for instance, half of the world population is at risk. These diseases were not common in certain areas. According to the WHO, climate change impacts social determinants as well as environmental ones. And this is well known that drinking water and sufficient food create the adequate conditions or inadequate ones to create more vulnerable communities. According to projections between 2030 and 2050, climate change will cause 250,000 deaths due to malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat strokes, which are being caused by heat waves that cause cardiac arrest and other diseases, especially in regions more south because of the extreme change of seasons. It is estimated that the direct cost of health, and excluding other costs such as water and sanitation, would be between 2,000 to $4,000 million from here to 2030. And so we can clearly deduce that in areas least developed, such as the majority of our countries, are the less capable ones of preparing to respond to these events because of financial reasons, structural reasons, and other reasons. But we know that these events might occur, so we have time to, and it's high time we prepared for the upcoming events, which some of them are already taking place. In the initial poll that you responded to, we saw that topics such as awareness raising, education were important for having a good practice community in the region. You also mentioned cross-disciplinarity. And so this is not an isolated topic. It's not something that concerns researchers or doctors or politicians, educators. It concerns everyone. All stakeholders are involved. Now, in terms of climate, then, and this is something that has been stirring the world, is migration. And this is not something new, since there is a record of this. 45,000 years ago, environmental changes and natural disasters have always played a role in the distribution of the population the world over throughout history. This has been taken from the International Organization for Migration. For example, the collapse of the Mayan civilization, according to some studies, between other political factors, has been considered part of a factor for this collapse has been extreme drought, because for several decades, rainfall has decreased significantly. It is believed that a period of warming promoted climate change that does not only result in negative impacts, but also creates change. So we need to analyze what those changes are and see how we can take advantage of these changes. It's not all doom and gloom. Yes, partly if we ignore them, but this can also become an opportunity if dealt with in the right way. So the Inca civilization, for instance, which populated Andean regions at great altitude, could do agriculture more easily. According to the World Bank, the projections for internal climate migration estimate that 143 million of people will be involved in some sort of migration by 2050 due to the climate in several parts of the world if measures are not taken.
Relocation, and this is also something that has to do with health. We usually mention physical health, but also migration and having to relocate, move from my culture, my region to a different region, of course, poses threats to physical health because there is a change in diet, because of agriculture and fishery, of course, are parts of the diet. But there's also an impact on mental health. And this is something worth mentioning because sometimes we don't pay enough attention to this. It's not just physical health, but it's also mental health. People lose their contact, their close family. So the climate crisis already is having effects, like we already mentioned. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, 17.2 million people have had to leave their homes last year because of disasters from various kinds. And studies show that those impacts, not, let's not say natural disasters, but disasters of a natural origin, caused mainly, we're talking about floods, but also droughts. And this has made a large number of people to have to leave their homes. We also have found something interesting, that there were around 300,000 premature deaths connected to heat waves in people over 65 years of age in 2018 in regions with extreme climates. Those of us who live around the equatorial area, this is easier. It's not as easy to understand because we don't have such large variations as it happens further north or further south. But this number of around 300,000 deaths caused by extreme heat is very significant. There were some studies in Australia about the mental health problems caused by droughts and wildfires. And it concluded that between 2015 and 2019, one of the consequences of droughts was that the number of people exposed to wildfires increased in 128 countries compared to baseline from 2001, 2004. So the number of wildfires is increasing. Most likely this can be attributed to changes in temperature as well. And the source for this is Meteorite MX. Now, Carolina shared this case with me of a study conducted in Guayaquil, in the city. This is a case study of dengue. We have had dengue for a few years. It's endemic, although we don't have too many studies on the historic trends that have caused the factors that have caused this situation. But this study tried to look at the environmental factors and the connection to the manifestations of dengue throughout a 10-year period. They used the records from that period and some climate variables and dengue, cases of dengue, of course. They analyzed the rainfall, temperatures, humidity, winds, looking at epidemiological weeks. So some of the results obtained in this study were that dengue, looking at these epidemiological week periods, compared to the rainfall, it showed that the relation, the association is little, a direct relation between the rainfall and the number of cases of dengue, but they did find a correlation between temperature and cases of dengue. When temperature ranged from 23 to 28, the incidence of dengue was lower. However, when temperatures range from 28 to 23 degrees Celsius, cases increase. Humidity as well also does have a close relationship, as the study showed. with cases of dengue when humidity in the environment is above 70%. So an average high humidity in those weeks, in epidemiological weeks 1 to 20, showed a marked increase in dengue cases. They also looked at winds, and it showed that when wind slows down, cases also slow down. So there is, again, a direct link between the wind and the number of cases. They also looked at dengue between the years 2010 and 2013, and dengue in the city of Guayaquil, and what happens in the temperature in the water around the coast of Ecuador. That region that called 3.4, this I mentioned the other one, and this area is called El Niño 1+2. It includes Ecuador. It's an area nearby. And so they looked at the link between dengue and the changes in this coastal region in sea temperature. And they observed that there's the increase in the water temperature in that area increases air temperature. So, and that decreases wind. So there was that indirect correlation. This graph is just to show the incidence of the number of dengue cases in the city. The high values that you can see in the graph are around the rainy season, February to March in 2020, where we can see quite a big increase. It's not just the only factor. It's not just because it's raining more. There's also more humidity, there are higher temperatures. So, but that's not the only factor. There are, of course, other factors, healthcare infrastructure, of course, but this is a factor that needs to be taken into account in order to take preventive action. And now, in closing with this section of the presentation, I wanted to discuss some ideas for work, for studies, exercises that could be applied. For example, we could begin looking at the number of events in which the temperature went over a certain threshold. I know that for my region, those could be indicators of an increase in the numbers of cases of a certain disease or epidemic that I'm looking at. For example, cholera, dengue, malaria, etc. Asthma as well. So how many times in the past decades have I had events where temperature went over a certain threshold? How many times in 2020 did temperature go over 27 degrees Celsius? How many times in 2021, etc. And to see if there is a trend in if those kinds of events are increasing or there are no significant changes. If there are changes, then there is a potential increase in the possibilities for diseases such as dengue and malaria to increase, only taking into account climate factors, of course. This idea that can be studied, of course, requires the involvement and the different practices and different groups of people, the creation of communities that deal with analyzing these kinds of problems and factors. Some measures that could be taken, this is taken from what the World Meteorological Organization reported in 2021. One is to assess the vulnerability of the national healthcare system. The vulnerability to the interruption of the services due to extreme climate variability events or climate trends, to improve investment on the national healthcare infrastructure, to improve the resilience of information and communication systems, healthcare facilities, training the number of professionals that can deal with these situations, lots of training on disease prevention and control, integrating climate change and risks to the health into public health programs that every country already has, as well as training on service and the study curriculum that are already taking place for people to work in healthcare, because we have seen that the climate directly affects health in many different ways. We have only looked at a few, but there are many ways. The World Meteorological Organization discussed also some adapting actions. I think you mentioned awareness at the beginning. I saw that awareness, raising awareness and awareness campaigns was one of the first things that you mentioned. Creating a national committee for preparedness, management, and response, developing early alert systems, just like we have those for the ones I know that deal with floods, but we can also do that with health issues. Also, promotion of intersectoral cooperation and international cooperation on adaptive measures as well. The important thing is to have groups of people that meet, that prepare studies, that develop their ideas. Also to improve preparedness and response at the community level. And in closing, a short message from the World Health Organization is that in the short and mid-term, the effects of climate change on health will be mainly determined by the vulnerability of populations. So we need to analyze how vulnerable the populations and territories are at the local level to the effects of climate change on health. What are the factors that make them vulnerable so that authorities can take action, can prioritize these factors that make those communities vulnerable, to work on those, to improve resilience as well. And in order to achieve adaptive measures. And finally, we would like to one more time ask you about your opinion on what the main health problem you think climate can cause in your territory. Dengue, malaria, and similar diseases, skin problems, stomach problems, heart problems, and respiratory problems. Just mention the one you think is the most significant. Of course, you probably want to mention more than one, but the platform only allows us to just select one. So what is, in your opinion, the most significant health problem that it can cause in your territory? Right, so we have the results, and almost 60% of you think that the main diseases and problems have to do with diseases such as dengue and malaria and similar diseases, and also respiratory diseases, with also a significant number of people selecting this option. So great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Juan José from CIFAN, the International Research Center for the El Niño phenomenon. Going to listen to Dr. Carolina Portaluppi. Dr. Carolina Portaluppi-Castro is joining us from Casa Grande University in Ecuador. She is an economist trained in human development and communication. She works at the Public Policies Masters. She's also teaches at the Andean Simon Bolivar University. She's experienced in comprehensive disaster risk management, risk reduction in educational communities, human development, public policies and economics. She has experience in social management, planning and project cycle management. She has a track record in the sector of social organizations of development, international cooperation, United Nations system, public sector, and academia. She was a member of the evaluation team of the effects and impacts of COVID-19 pandemic in March-December 2020 in Ecuador, and accompanied the Vice President of the Republic for the implementation of mitigation actions during the pandemic. She, as a technical assistant to UNICEF, she coordinated the formulation of the first disaster risk reduction policy in the educational community in Ecuador and the four-year public investment project. As Minister of the Litoral, she coordinated the humanitarian response to the floods in Ecuador.
Carolina Portaluppi-Castro, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us today in this course. Welcome. Hello, good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to ask you if you can see a slide and my PowerPoint presentation. Yes, we can see it. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to thank the organizers of this course, the Climate and Health Responder course for Latin America, and to say to them that from my trajectory and my itinerary in my professional training and work, the way in which I will address this is as a post-disaster approach as an opportunity to include mitigation and risk measures to increase resilience. Just briefly, I'm going to share the learning goals, some preliminary notions. We're going to place ourselves in the integrated risk management, and as one of the most important processes, the post-recovery disaster. And we're going to share some cases of El Salvador, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. The objective set out for today is to define the role in disaster risk reduction and in strengthening the resilience and capability to adapt in the prevention of impacts on health of extreme climate events. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I wanted to just briefly go through, as a reminder, some notions that have been dealt with during the course. One of them has to do with the systemic nature of a multidimensional nature of risk, also from a risk disaster approach. This is one of the greatest threats in the current century and has a greater impact in health, as pointed out by the Pan American Health Organization. There's also a link, which I thought was clearly established by between climate risk, disaster risk from a health perspective, and also how we construct risk, how climate risk is constructed, and how disaster risk is constructed, and the common impacts between them. In this case, we have an approach construction of risk, which is then represented via this equation, where on the one hand, there are threats of climate change, vulnerability, and exposure, and there is a inverted proportionate relationship between disasters, and that's known as the capacity feature. I would now like to share with you the full circle where you can see the relationships between climate change, extreme climate events, and how these events increase the risk of disasters, and how this has an effect and impact on health, and how in this context we see recovery processes, post-disaster ones, that include this concept of build back better, which also includes the need to include capacity measures to adapt, as well as mitigation ones. This, and in the case of José's presentation, which showed us clearly how this is determining events such as El Niño and La Niña. In red color, we can see on the outer lines of the PowerPoint, you see that what occurs is linked to the concept of integrated risk reduction management and the different processes. So for instance, there is a need to have good preparation, both as a response and as part of the recovery processes. At some point, we were only talking about preparation for responses, but preparation for recovery is being included in the debate more and more. After events have occurred, we also need to have a strong capacity to respond in an integrated manner, especially protecting the populations from a social perspective, but also nature, which is a relatively modern notion, and also including mitigation measures for risks. Once the topics of response and mitigation start to reduce, so to speak, we need to start thinking of the process of recovery. And this recovery process includes reconstructing better and leaving no one behind, and by including all these risk reduction measures, as well as adaptation and mitigation for climate change. We also need to acknowledge the relationships, increasing relationships, and more intense between climate change and disaster risk. I would like now to ask you, which of the following processes in integrated disaster risk management would be the most well-known? Risk disaster understanding, preparation of humanitarian response, risk disaster prevention, humanitarian response for emergencies and disasters, mitigation of risk disaster, preparation for recovery, post-disaster level, and post-disaster recovery. I wanted to ask you if you were more familiar with some of these in your country, or if these are the predominant processes in your regions. So you have the floor now. Thank you for answering. Let's take just a minute to have an idea of what the situation is in your countries. Which processes of integrated risk, disaster risk management are the most well known, or you're the most familiar with in your countries? All right. So, you've identified actually what happens in reality. Preparation for response is a process that our countries have been advancing. Also, understanding of risk, something related to humanitarian response and prevention, mitigation, and the least addressed one is preparation for post-disaster recovery, and recovery in itself. Until only recently, recovery processes post-disaster level were quite spontaneous, and communities themselves would carry them out with a bit of international cooperation and little accountability from states. But more and more, awareness has rose in terms of preparing and planning post-disaster, because from a national strategy perspective, the recovery process is related to decisions and actions that are made after a disaster with the aim of restoring the living conditions of the affected communities, at the same time as the necessary changes for reducing risks are promoted and adopted. We don't want to reconstruct the same risks, but we want to include recovery processes that include rehabilitation and reconstruction as opportunities to develop and apply measures to reduce risk cases. In this example, also related to the previous slide that I showed and that we analyzed only a few minutes ago. In this change, the perspective is to see the integrated risk management in terms of climate change and health, but from a recovery perspective. So, for example, in this case, in the circle, we can see that more and more climate change is creating extreme climate events. José mentioned floods, droughts, great storms, rising sea levels, and how this increases the risk of disasters and has a direct impact on the health of the population, which have been dealt with in the course, the increase of morbidity and mortality, the increase of respiratory disease and problems with water, displacement, malnutrition. And in this case, the challenge is to advance the process of recovery with an approach on these effects and these impacts without leaving anyone behind. And at the same time, as the concept shows, we need to address the root causes and address the vulnerabilities and risks. So within this concept of recovery, we need to include measures such as poverty reduction and reduction of inequalities, social protection, promoting healthcare, water and sanitation, waste management, and restoring forest ecosystems. The idea is also to intervene in positive production patterns that are not sustainable at the moment and which are responsible in a way of the increase in climate change. I would now like to ask you whether you know the assessment methodology of post-disaster needs assessment. I wanted to see if you knew this methodology, if you're familiar with it. If you know whether it's being used, applied in your respective countries. So, I would now like to have a look at this because only 6% have answered yes and 94% have replied no. So I now like to share with you what this methodology is and why I wanted to mention it. The post-disaster needs assessment is a methodology that has been harmonized between the United Nations system, the World Bank, and the European Union, but is being used by more stakeholders at global level, and it's a methodology to estimate the recovery needs after a disaster's left. And the idea is that based on these recovery needs, which need to be prioritized, recovery strategy is created, which allows to mobilize financial and technical resources so that these recovery processes, which, as you well pointed out, are processes that are relatively recent in the risk reduction agenda and that can be implemented. This methodology addresses all sectors, the productive and sector and its main activities, economic activities in a country. It also addresses an analysis from the effects and impacts in the social sector related to housing, education, health, and culture, as well as the effects and impact in terms of infrastructure such as water and sanitation, community infrastructure, electricity, transport, and telecommunications. It's also a methodology that is not based on one sector alone, but it's cross-cutting. Gender issues, governance, environment, risk reduction, and employment, as well as livelihoods. This is a typical process for this methodology. It involves these 5 steps, and we always start from the context, which was the pre-disaster context or the baseline before the disaster took place in that country or affected territory. Then we move on to analyze the effects, and these effects are the direct result of the disaster, but are analyzed from these different dimensions. There is in a dimension of infrastructure and active assets, the effects on production and distribution to goods and services, an effect on governance and on the increase of risk. Also, based on these effects, we analyze the impact at an economic level that the disaster has caused, but also the human and social impact. On these first 3 steps, we establish the needs or the gaps needed for recovery. And when we analyze these needs, we include the concept of build back better or a better construction, and including disaster risk reduction measures that could also include adaptive measures or mitigation measures for climate change. And based on these needs for recovery, we then determine the strategies that are needed. These are the 5 steps involved in the aforementioned methodology. I think it's interesting to highlight what I was mentioning, that the methodology in every sector focuses on these 4 dimensions. And why? Because until only recently, when we were conducting an assessment on an emergency or a disaster in a given territory, area, sector, or country, the main approach, the predominant approach, was the kind of effect or impact that it had had in terms of infrastructure and physical assets. And in any case, when we were conducting a post-assessment, post-disaster assessment, the approach was focused on the effects and impacts on these infrastructure, on these assets and infrastructure. How many ambulances or rooms or schools were affected, how many shelters were concerned, but the post-disaster needs assessment has a more comprehensive approach that sets or assesses the effects on infrastructure and physical assets or the damages caused, but it also includes this other perspective, which integrates access to production and access to goods and services. It concerns governance and the increase of vulnerability and risk. This methodology is being used more and more, and it really offers the opportunity to have a unique assessment, because that was also another issue, that whenever a disaster took place, there were several assessments being conducted, and sometimes information was useless because it was very dispersed and was very diverse. In some cases, it was even contradictory, and that affected decision making. This is just to mention that between 2020 and 2021, this methodology was used to perform an economic assessment in Ecuador, as well as Sandins and Granadina, because of a volcano eruption. It was also used in El Salvador to conduct an assessment on COVID-19, but also tropical storms. In Guatemala, it was used for the tropical phenomenon, as well as in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti after the earthquake, and in Uruguay after the COVID-19. So this methodology underwent a few changes after COVID-19. That's why we talked about the post-disaster needs assessment as well as the COVID-19 recovery needs assessment. And it is flexible enough to adapt to different contexts. I would now like to share with you some examples. We have little time now to finish with your presentation, so we can then answer the questions. It's been over 20 minutes. Okay, so I'll just rush through this. It's just a few examples. In the case of El Salvador, for instance, the most interesting aspect of this experience was that it integrated two assessments, the effect of COVID and the effect of tropical storms. And as you can see on this slide, the effects in terms of health are extremely important, and they are featured as losses. In the case of Guatemala, the important thing to point out in this case is that in the first step of applying the methodology during the context analysis, we realized how vulnerability levels in the case of Guatemala explain the main effects, severe effects, of the tropical phenomenon.
And with this analysis, Guatemala was able to establish a recovery strategy with some strategic lines of action. In the Dominican Republic, the interesting thing is that they analyzed COVID, and we see that healthcare was the most impacted sector and the one with the biggest social impact of losses. But the case of the Dominican Republic is interesting because of the recovery strategy. If you can look at the axis number 2, you can bring this down to earth and connect it to the national development strategy. And finally, in Ecuador, something very similar happened. Healthcare was the most impacted social sector. And the interesting thing is that when they did the assessment, they included what Juan José was mentioning, an analysis of the institutional vulnerability of the healthcare sector in order to plan adaptive actions, thinking of healthcare issues. I'm closing here. There are some challenges for this methodology, but I would like to know if you have any questions. I can answer some of the challenges that this approach has because it's quite new. So I'm here and I can listen to any questions you may have. Thank you, Carolina Portaluppi-Castro. I remind you that we are collecting all of your questions and we're going to follow up via email with the speakers because we not always have time to answer all of them. I'm going to ask a short question from each of the speakers. Now to Dr. Juan José Nieto, because this is mostly healthcare, people working on healthcare and who are starting to learn about climate change. One concern was that these events are unpredictable. We can establish early alert systems, but how can we begin to build preparedness about climate change, especially taking into account extreme events? Well, I'm learning about healthcare issues, so that is why it's interesting to have these communities. For early alert systems, one thing we need is monitoring with triggers such as increases in temperature, rainfalls when they go over certain thresholds that have been established based on studies. And from that, connect with people who understand and who know about these healthcare issues. I'm sure many of the participants know and or can think of any idea of what can be done when an early alert system says, for example, well, weather conditions indicate that there's a chance that the vector that spreads dengue or malaria can increase in numbers. So then we can, the certain protocol can kick in. So, but what we need is to start with communication. So if I understand, the main thing would be identifying areas of risk factors, the conditions for specific diseases, and connected with these risk factors. Yes, that is it. And communication is key. Interdisciplinary communication between sectors at the different levels. Can you go a bit further into that? Yes, certainly. The definition of these practice communities, one of the sectors that have to do with climate can explain what the conditions are and the criteria. Because we are looking at, we're dealing with nature, so we cannot be categorical. We can discuss or we can speak in probabilities. I always think of an example. If we put a certain number of spheres into a box of different colors, 5 spheres that are red, 5 that are blue, 5 that are green, and we pick one and take one out. If we don't have forecasts, we don't know which one I'm going to take out. But if we have a sort of a forecast, and if we change the proportion, if I have 9 that are red and the rest are blue or green, and if I pick one, then it's more likely that I'm going to pick a red one. So forecasting is sort of a bet on somebody studies the area and can tell me with more likelihood what the conditions are going to be, and then based on that we can decide what measures we can take, of course taking into account the uncertainty that every forecast has. Well, now for Dr. Carolina Portaluppi, for impoverished populations that do not want to relocate, so they are living on a risky area, but they depend on living there because of their economic activity or what they do. So what do you think we could do in those areas? Well, studies indicate that resettlement processes for human beings are very complex. We have guidelines from the uh, Social and Economic Rights Pact, and that establish the cases in which we should manage relocation processes. Let's remember that in Latin America, urbanization has been a reverse process, unplanned processes. In countries such as mine, 75% of the cities have been built informally, so there are space segregation problems that have people occupying high-risk areas. So maybe we don't just need to think of resettlement, but also mitigating disaster risks and increasing the population's capacity for preparedness, for response, for recovery, and also for early alert systems and processes, because in countries such as ours, it would be very difficult to have large resettlement processes for the population because of the structural characteristics that they have. So what we can do is to prevent new settlements. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you both. I remind you that on Thursday we are having our next session that has to do with food safety and water. Remember that you can still get enrolled in this course. Be mindful and keep an eye on your email to receive the presentations, and encourage your colleagues to enroll. Again, Dr. Juan José Nieto and economist Carolina Portaluppi, thank you for sharing your knowledge, and we will be following up on all of your questions via email. Thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.